5 mujeres salvajemente mutiladas fueron las víctimas del más famoso asesino en serie de toda la historia criminal. Se le conoció como Jack el Destripador, un egocéntrico asesino cuya afición era extraer los órganos de sus víctimas. Aterrorizó las calles de Londres en el otoño de 1888. ¿Quién fue Jack el Destripador? ¿Por qué no ha sido aún identificado? Biografía indaga en estas preguntas mientras que ahonda en el perfil de una de las figuras más notorias e intrigantes de la historia criminal. El fantasma de la muerte, Jack el Destripador.
Mi cuchillo es tan bello y afilado. Quiero ponerlo a trabajar ahora mismo si tengo la oportunidad. Buena suerte. Siempre suyo, Jack el Destripador.
It's a year after Sherlock Holmes first appeared in print. You've got the Victorian gaslit streets of London. You've also got the appeal of the name, Jack the Ripper.
The murders became famous. Once the name Jack the Ripper had been invented, they became a total sensation.
It was not enough only that the woman should be killed, but also should be mutilated. Be sure about that. Every part of the body should be hacked together.
They were the first sexual serial murders to occur in a major town, a leading capital city, and they were the first to achieve international publicity.
In the history of American crime.
Due ragazze sono morte.
What fascinates people is not the murders themselves, it's the puzzle. Who? Who did it? Why weren't they caught? And it's that puzzle which teases everybody.
Jack el Destripador. Fantasma de la muerte. Londres, Inglaterra, West End, ciudad de comercio, cultura y de la alta moda. Una sociedad de caballeros acaudalados, ataviados con sombreros de copa y trajes de cola. Sus esposas son gentiles damas, sus hijos son atendidos por niñeras. La reina Victoria es el poder supremo. Por el contrario, en East End viven 900.000 personas en pobreza crítica, hacinados en casas miserables y familias enteras carecen de hogar. Whitechapel, el área más miserable de todas, fue el escenario de los asesinatos. Esta comunidad pobre fue ignorada por el Londres de la era victoriana.
The East End, having become a dirty, run-down industrial district, now, in a time of economic depression at the end of the 1880s, was an area of overcrowding, misery and unemployment, and an area where at any time almost any woman might have to prostitute herself as the only way to feed her children. I've talked to person after person from the East End today who said yes, they always reckoned Grandma had to go out on the streets when time was bad, and nobody thought any of the worse of her for it.
The life of these women, one tends to sometimes forget, is just how brutal and how harsh it was. You could buy one of these women for 3 pennies, or 2 pennies, or a loaf of stale bread. The price of 3 pennies was fixed because that was what the women would pay for a large glass of gin.
Querido padre, te escribo para decirte que te alegrará saber que ya estoy en mi nueva casa y que todo va bien. Hay mucha gente amable y no tengo mucho que hacer. Espero que estés bien y que el chico haya funcionado. Adiós por ahora. Siempre tuya, Polly. Responde pronto para saber cómo estás.
Polly Nichols was murdered on the 31st of August 1888, and on that particular day she'd had 3 customers, but she'd spent the money on gin. So when she turned up at the lodging house to get a bed for the night, not only was she drunk, but she didn't have any money for a bed, but she felt pretty confident about getting a 4th customer because she thought she looked particularly attractive. And the reason she thought she looked so attractive was because she was wearing a new hat. I mean, she was drunk, she's got 5 front teeth missing, but she was wearing this new hat. And the last words to the lodging house keeper were, "See what a jolly bonnet I'm wearing."
August the 31st, 1888 was the first Ripper murder. Mary Ann Nichols, known as Polly, a streetwalker in her early 40s, was found dead in Bucks Row, Whitechapel at approximately in the morning. She had been dead approximately 20 minutes when she was found, and in the mortuary they discovered that not only had her throat been cut, but there was a great gash in her abdomen. Now, these murders became very famous for a most peculiar reason. The very first elections to the London County Council were taking place, and the radicals, the extreme leftists, thought they had a very good chance of winning the East End. The radical newspapers, particularly the Star and the Pall Mall Gazette, 2 London evening newspapers, realized that if they wrote up the murders, they could draw attention to the terrible social conditions of the East End, and they did. And they sold more papers than anybody had thought possible.
As far as the public attention was concerned, you could see that journalists were absolutely responsible for part of the fear and the fervour. When you look at the papers of the time, you see the lurid front-page illustrations on police news and equally lurid treatment of the subject on the inside. Even the Times fell for it. Even the Times was swept away by Ripper fervour and Ripper fever.
A nameless reprobate.
Half beast, half man is at large.
Deadly, cunning.
Insatiable thirst for blood.
If you could take my unit and I back to 1888 to the crime scene, I would suggest that we focus in on the first homicide. Generally, the first homicide is the focal point, is the area where the subject feels the most comfortable. And that would be the area where either he is employed or where he resides. I believe the subject would go back to the scene, go back there and kind of hang around there and fantasize and relive the crime.
You can have situations where the murderer's standing here, the victim's lying there, the murderer's covered in the victim's blood, he's left his fingerprints and handprints all over the murder scene. There's no way you could combine the two. The scientific knowledge didn't exist for that to happen. So literally, you have got to catch the murderer in the act of murder.
On the 8th of September 1888, at 10 to 6 in the morning, the second victim was found. She had been kicked out of her nearby lodging house at midnight for not having the money she needed to pay for her bed. She expected to earn it, but clearly didn't find it, as she was last seen alive at 5:15, negotiating with a client who was probably Jack the Ripper on the pavement outside number 29 Hanbury Street. Her throat had been cut. She had been savagely mutilated, disemboweled, and her uterus taken away.
If ever the Ripper was going to be caught, it was then. Because they're out in the backyard and a man in the next door house comes down to the yard, obviously to relieve himself, because this is what the yards were used for. And he's standing there and he hears something fall against the fence and a woman's voice say, "No." Now the fence is only 5 foot high. All he's got to do is look over the fence and he would have seen Chapman with her killer, with the Ripper.
In these extraordinarily difficult cases where a roaming sexual killer attacks people he doesn't know, so you can't follow up people's associates. If he attacks prostitutes, he's attacking women who automatically go off to dark corners with half a dozen strange men every day. How on earth are you going to find which one is doing the killing?
I think by Victorian standards, the investigation into the series of Whitechapel murders was conducted as well as possibly they could manage in those days. They put extra manpower on the streets. They had intensive door-to-door inquiries. All leads were followed up, even ridiculous leads.
Las prostitutas lo describen como un hombre de la localidad que las ha estado amenazando.
Es bajo y grueso, y tiene el cabello muy negro, y un bigote negro, y el cuello más delgado que haya visto. Lleva una gorra y una especie de delantal de cuero, y mece su cuchillo mientras dice, te voy a desgarrar.
When the Ripper murders began, the Metropolitan Police, they rapidly announced that although they couldn't name him, they didn't even know his name, their principal suspect was a local poor Polish Jewish immigrant, nicknamed Leather Apron.
Inmediatamente Scotland Yard arresta a John Pizer, el hombre del delantal de cuero, para evitar que la prensa publique artículos incitantes sobre un inmigrante que amenazaba a las mujeres de Londres. No había evidencia que incriminara a Pizer en los asesinatos y fue liberado rápidamente. Pero el incidente acentuó las tensiones étnicas en el East End.
The Irish were resented by the native English. The Irish themselves resented the new influx of Jewish immigrants who settled particularly in the parish of Whitechapel because that was where the ancient two synagogues of London had always been, and they were racing in, fleeing the pogroms of Russia and Bismarck's clearances of Jews in Silesia.
Onto that Jewish community is projected the idea that it's a Jew that is the Ripper, the murderer, because no Englishman, no East Ender, would actually have committed such a crime. So the Jews are already becoming, the immigrant Jew is becoming the scapegoat and the suspect for the Ripper murders.
La policía vuelve sus sospechas hacia los médicos que realizaban amputaciones y cirugía. Quizá el asesino que extraía los órganos a sus víctimas era un médico.
It is apparently an amputation knife, a late 19th century amputation knife. And certainly it's the sort of weapon which could have done the murders.
A number of medical students whose brains had been unhinged were being sought after. And in fact, there was a time when to be a doctor and to carry a bag around made you an enormously suspicious person.
The idea that the Ripper was a doctor came from one and one only of the medics who examined the bodies. Dr. Baxter Phillips, after examining Annie Chapman's body, said this was the work of an expert.
El abdomen había sido totalmente abierto. Los intestinos, despojados de sus ligamentos mesentéricos, fueron sacados del cuerpo y colocados sobre los hombros de la víctima, mientras que la pelvis, el útero y sus apéndices habían sido totalmente extirpados. Obviamente, era el trabajo de un experto o de alguien con suficientes conocimientos de anatomía como para desprender los órganos pélvicos con un solo corte.
The people at the top had the medical evidence surveyed by Dr. Bond of Westminster, a police surgeon they trusted implicitly, and Bond's full report on all the medical evidence in the case said no skill at all, not even the skill of a butcher.
Después de 2 espectrales asesinatos, muchos ciudadanos preocupados enviaron cartas a los detectives de Scotland Yard, sugiriendo a la policía métodos para atrapar al asesino. La idea más popular era apostar en las calles policías armados disfrazados de prostitutas. Después, el 29 de septiembre, la oficina recibió una nota supuestamente escrita por el propio asesino. La firma era brillante.
Apreciado jefe, siguen diciendo que la policía me atrapó, pero ni siquiera me han ubicado. Ese chiste sobre el delantal de cuero me produjo un ataque de risa. Estoy tras las prostitutas y las seguiré desgarrando hasta el fin. En el próximo trabajo, yo.
Ahora Scotland Yard estaba realmente atemorizada ante la inminencia del próximo ataque del misterioso maníaco de Whitechapel.
Mi cuchillo es tan bello y afilado. Quiero ponerlo a trabajar ahora mismo si tengo la oportunidad. Buena suerte. Siempre suyo, Jack el Destripador.
The name, Jack the Ripper, probably invented by a journalist, certainly first appearing in the Dear Boss letter. But what a name for an undiscovered ghoul.
Charles Warren, jefe de Scotland Yard, estaba atrapado. El asesino seguía suelto. Sus superiores estaban furiosos y el público no confiaba en él. La prensa radical también pedía su cabeza. Una villa cuadrada en el centro de Londres tenía su propio cuerpo de policía. La policía de la ciudad de Londres y su comisionado, el mayor Henry Smith, estaban a punto de ser arrastrados en la búsqueda de Jack el Destripador.
Extra reinforcements were put into the area. And also, it seems silly now, although I'm sure the intention was well meant, notice was given out advising the prostitutes to stay off the street.
24 horas más tarde, los peores temores de la policía se habían vuelto realidad.
The first victim that night was Elizabeth Stride, nicknamed Long Liz. She had been seen hustling for trade up and down a little road called Berners Street in the East End during the evening from 11 p.m. Her body was found at about 1 o'clock in Dutfield's Yard, a little opening off Berners Street. Her throat had been cut, but she'd not been mutilated, and it is thought that the Ripper may have been frightened off by hearing Diemschutz's pony and trap approaching.
Murder slipped out from behind the gateway, headed west, and crossed the invisible boundary. No big wall or ditch to jump. It's just crossing from one side of the street to the other. Crosses from Scotland Yard territory into the city. It is there, then, he picks up the second prostitute on that night, a prostitute called Catherine Eddowes.
Night, old cock.
The second murder on the night of the double murders was that of Catherine Eddowes. Her body was found at about 1:45 in Mitre Square in the City of London. She had been appallingly mutilated, her throat cut, V's cut in her cheeks pointing up to the eyes, her eyelids nicked through, the tip of her nose cut off, and the usual ripping and abdominal mutilation, with her uterus and one kidney taken away by the murder.
Now, nobody has seen or heard a thing. Not the policeman on the beat, the policeman and his family, in the house opposite, the night porter with the door partly open. They didn't actually have to see the square or be present on it, because Mitre Square had an echo on it. He's now killed once on Scotland Yard territory, Metropolitan Police territory. He's now killed once on City of London Police territory. So you've got search parties coming from both directions looking for him. And he's in between. I mean, he's very confident, he's very arrogant.
El comisionado Smith de la Policía de Londres inmediatamente asignó hombres al caso. No permitiría que lo tildaran de incompetente y de caso perdido, tal como lo pintaron las caricaturas de la prensa a su homólogo Sir Charles Warren. Al mismo tiempo, 4.500 mujeres de Leeds End, preocupadas por sus burdeles y ruidosas tabernas en Whitechapel, firmaron una apasionada carta dirigida a la reina.
Madame, nosotras, las mujeres del este de Londres, nos sentimos aterrorizadas ante el espantoso pecado que se ha cometido recientemente entre nosotros y lamentamos la desgracia que ha caído sobre nuestra comunidad. Hemos aprendido mucho de las vidas de estas hermanas que han perdido el rumbo de Dios y que viven una existencia triste. Rogamos a su majestad llamar a los sirvientes que están bajo su autoridad y urgirlos a que restablezcan el orden y la ley en esas malas casas entre cuyas paredes se cometen atrocidades y donde hombres y mujeres arruinan su cuerpo y alma, sus fervientes servidoras.
There was a feeling that what happened to these women deserved to happen to them. The average Victorian regarded a prostitute as a gay woman. Now, they use the word gay not in this sense that we use it today as meaning homosexual. They use the word gay as meaning nymphomania. Prostitutes were all nymphomaniacs. That was why they were prostitutes. Therefore, they were on the streets for their pleasure. The fact that they were there out of sheer economic desperation and necessity is rarely considered. Therefore, they're on the streets for their pleasure. The wages of sin is death. Therefore, what happened to them? Deserved to happen. So why waste too much time over these women? It's another piece of street cleaning.
Luego del asesinato de Catherine Eddowes, las mujeres del West End comenzaron a temer por sus vidas. El destripador no solo estaba sediento de sangre, era además impredecible.
This was someone who was killing individuals, but was clearly sending a message to society generally, so that everyone begins to perceive him as talking to them directly. And that's the change that happens. is when the killer suddenly realizes, I'm only killing one person at a time, but in a way I am assaulting society.
15.000 guardias vigilaban las calles. 500 agentes secretos merodeaban en los muelles del Covent Garden. Entre ellos el director del Banco de Inglaterra, disfrazado como un empleado común. La necesidad hizo que se inventara los zapatos con suela de caucho.
Al igual que cientos de otros, me incluyeron allí para patrullar las calles. Por lo general lo hacíamos en parejas, sin gran éxito. Sin embargo, anticipamos un gran invento comercial. A nuestras incómodas botas se les colocó caucho en las suelas. Eso las hizo muy silenciosas al caminar.
Unfortunately, the inquiry was under two separate directions. The city police, with their involvement with Catherine Eddowes' murder, the one canonical murder that took place in the city, held a separate investigation, and although the two forces were supposed to liaise, and did liaise quite well at ground level, the chiefs didn't get on, and the chiefs did not properly exchange information.
Pronto, los ciudadanos tomaron el asunto en sus propias manos.
We know that the vigilante groups arrested people on the streets. We get accounts of people being taken to stations and obviously embarrassed police officers having to arrest sort of quite respectable gentlemen out on the street. Possibly, too, they released the Ripper on occasion. It's speculation, but nonetheless, it is something to be considered.
George Lusk, jefe del comité de vigilancia de Whitechapel, recibió una carta enviada desde el infierno, probablemente del verdadero asesino. La sintaxis era claramente irlandesa y el sobre contenía partes de un riñón humano.
Señor Lusk, le envío la mitad del riñón que le saqué a una mujer y que le guardé. El otro pedazo lo freí y me lo comí. Estaba muy bueno. Podría enviarle el cuchillo ensangrentado que usé si tiene un poco más de paciencia. Atrápeme si puede, señor Lusk.
George Bernard Shaw, irlandés de 32 años, socialista y crítico, escribió una de sus famosas cartas a la prensa.
Hace menos de un año, West End clamaba literalmente por la sangre de aquellos que perseguían a Charles Warren para que exterminara a la chusma que se atrevía a reclamar que estaban muriendo de hambre. Un comportamiento típico de la clase alta cuando la clase trabajadora se atreve a infundir en ellos terror al mostrar sus colmillos. Mientras tanto, los demócratas convencionales estaban gastando nuestro dinero en educación, agitación y organización. Algún genio independiente estaba tomando el asunto en sus manos.
Un criminal maníaco llamado Jack el Destripador había asesinado a 4 mujeres. ¿Cuántas más habrían de morir antes de capturarlo?
It escalates. It constantly escalates. And we see this more clearly probably in the Ripper case than in anything else. The constant escalation of mutilation.
You've got the murderer. He's now working to some timetable of his own. It goes like this. 31st of August, he kills Polly Nichols. 8th of September, he kills Annie Chapman. 30th of September is a double event. He kills Stride and Eddowes. 8th of October, nothing happens. 30th of October, nothing happens. The night of the 8th, 9th of November, he meets his 5th and final victim. And this is this young prostitute called Mary Kelly. On the night of the 8th, 9th of November, it's raining, she's out on the street, she's looking for customers. She picks one up around about midnight, takes him back to her room, and one of the other prostitutes sees her drawing the curtains of her room, and as she did so, Kelly is singing a music hall song. It was only a violet I plucked from my mother's grave. Around about 3:30 in the morning, she picks up the Ripper. Some people living in Miller's Court hear a faint cry of murder. It's almost certain that it was at that point that the Ripper, lying on the bed beside Mary Kelly, throws the sheet over her head and makes his first thrust through the sheet with a knife. He has several hours to work over.
She had been absolutely savagely mutilated, almost cut to pieces, her abdomen entirely emptied and the contents left scattered around on the bed beside her. Pieces of flesh had been left on a table beside the bed. Her heart had been extracted from her thorax And it is possible, from the way the doctor described this, that that was taken away.
There is the photograph of the murder. She's lying on the bed facing the window. You can just see the puff sleeves of her chemise. This is what confronts the police when they get there to begin the investigation.
La noticia sobre la espantosa muerte de Mary Kelly sacudió al mundo.
Eine furchtbare Morde in London in Whitechapel. Das ganze Stadt.
Cinq femmes mutilées. Nothing in the history of American crime can, with special horror, be said to outmatch East End butchery.
El horrendo asesinato de Mary Kelly alarmó al Palacio de Buckingham y turbó profundamente a la reina Victoria, quien no tardó en enviar un telegrama a su primer ministro con un urgente mensaje. Este nuevo y terrible asesinato muestra la necesidad absoluta de acciones más radicales. Todas las cortes deben estar atentas y nuestros detectives mejor entrenados. Sir Charles Warren, el acosado jefe de la Scotland Yard, ya iba hacia su destino. El quinto asesinato del Destripador selló su suerte. Warren renunció.
That must have been another great high for him. I did all this. I caused this sensation. It's my doing. And again, it feeds the vanity and the arrogance.
Noviembre 12, 1888. Mi nombre es Joseph Barnett. Vivo en el 24 y 25.
El amante de Mary Kelly, Joseph Barnett, fue citado por el forense para que identificara lo que había quedado del diezmado cuerpo de Kelly.
Viví 1 año y 8 meses con la difunta. He visto el cuerpo e identifiqué su oreja y sus ojos.
Ahora, el Destripador había asesinado 5 mujeres en actos de violencia cada vez más intensos. La Scotland Yard y la policía de la ciudad mantenían agentes adicionales en las calles y continuaban buscando al fantasma de la muerte.
The police at the time were hampered. They were hampered by the fact that they had no experience of sexual serial murders. They had no files to look at. They had no reliable consultants who could come along and say, it'll be a man like this, look for this sort of man. They therefore were looking for the traditional madman, someone who was, say, foaming at the mouth or had a vacant stare.
If I was conducting an interrogation of this individual back then, I probably would focus in on the fact, if it was Jack, say, hey, Jack, I know you got blood on you, Jack. I know you got blood on you. It's not a question of whether or not you did it or not. I know you did it, but I know you got blood on you.
I think you can say Jack the Ripper was cunning rather than clever. Clever he may have been, we just don't know. But certainly he had luck on his side and must have had a degree of animal cunning to escape the police net.
5 mujeres habían sido brutalmente asesinadas y aún nadie podía identificar al hombre que había cometido los crímenes. 4 años más tarde, en 1892, el caso de Jack el Destripador fue cerrado. 2 años después, Sir Neville Macnaghten, un alto funcionario de Scotland Yard, escribió un memorándum señalando a 3 sospechosos.
Nunca nadie vio al asesino de Whitechapel. Muchos homicidas maníacos eran sospechosos, pero no existían evidencias que los incriminara. Mencioné 3 sospechosos. El señor M.J. Druitt, de buena familia, desapareció en la época del asesinato de Miller Court, cuyo cuerpo fue hallado en el Támesis unas 7 semanas después del homicidio. Era un enfermo sexual y, según fuentes confidenciales, al parecer hasta su propia familia creía que era el asesino. Michael Ostrog, un médico ruso y convicto detenido en un asilo para lunáticos, era un homicida maníaco. Kosminski, judío polaco y residente de Whitechapel, sentía un intenso odio hacia las prostitutas. Fue trasladado a un sanatorio para enfermos mentales en marzo de 1889.
La nota de Macnaghten fue publicada en 1915 y desde entonces los criminólogos han cuestionado su autenticidad. El jefe Anderson de la Policía Metropolitana escribió que el Destripador había sido plenamente identificado. Era un judío de la localidad, recogido después de los últimos asesinatos y llevado a un sanatorio. No podía ser nombrado ni juzgado porque se había vuelto loco y no podía defenderse.
When you search the asylum records, looking for an immigrant patient from Whitechapel who fits, there is only one who fits with the timing of the end of the murders, and that is a man called David Cohen, 23 years old, who was taken by the Metropolitan Police because he had had a fit of raving mania and they picked him up on the streets. He was taken by the police 4 weeks after the last murder. It looks as though David Cohen was the man they believed was Jack the Ripper.
En el siglo XIX, la policía creía que el asesino en serie era un homicida maníaco. Esta opinión se expandió en el siglo XX, cuando 70 sospechosos más fueron señalados como Jack el Destripador. El nombre Jack el Destripador se ha convertido en un símbolo de terror en todo el mundo. Las historias sobre fantasmas de la muerte son tan atractivas que hasta el gran maestro del cine macabro, Alfred Hitchcock, basó su primera película en la historia de un inquilino a quien se le confundió con Jack el Destripador. En esta película, Jack es llamado el Vengador. En 1932, el director Maurice Eldy produjo su versión de este mismo tema, El fantasma loco. Las películas sobre la mitología de Jack el Destripador nos entretienen, pero existen muchas teorías al respecto. La especulación es un juego justo.
I could give you a lovely story that Oscar Wilde was Jack the Ripper. Nobody's ever suggested it, but take it from me, he wasn't.
The only person who hasn't been dragged in yet, and I'm just waiting for it to happen, I've thrown out a few in, is Florence Nightingale. And Queen Victoria herself. Both of those are completely out of the score for the moment, but just wait.
Cream has been put forward as a suspect for Jack the Ripper, although he was in prison in Illinois in the USA at the time of the Ripper murders, which I think writes him off conclusively. The Cream theory originates from the fact that the hangman Billington, whilst on the scaffold hanging Cream, heard the words "I'm Jack the" as the trapdoor was sprung, and then it was cut off by the rope.
Jill la Destripadora. Las especulaciones de Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, creador de Sherlock Holmes, lo llevaron al personaje de Jill la Destripadora. Si un hombre se disfrazara de mujer común, podría moverse libremente por las calles con sus ropas ensangrentadas, sin ser notado. George Chapman, colgado en 1903 por envenenar a sus esposas.
Chapman does remain a plausible suspect. He was, of course, a different sort of killer when apprehended at the turn of the century. He was poisoning wives. Now, this is a far cry from a lust killer murdering prostitutes.
Dr. Rosalind Dunston. Si le fascina el misterio de Jack el Destripador, entonces usted es parte de toda una legión. Las técnicas modernas del FBI fueron herramientas que los historiadores usaron para proclamar al Dr. Rosalind D. Dunston como un destripador plausible. Comenzó a prestar su juramento a la edad de 18 años como cirujano y soldado en la campaña italiana Giuseppe Garibaldi en 1885.
And bit by bit, over a long period, as I managed to find out about his service with Garibaldi, I managed to find out his medical experience, I managed to find out his association with prostitutes, I managed to find that 5 people independently at a later date were pointing to him as the Ripper, or potentially the Ripper. Most important of all, in 1896, W.T. Stead, the former editor of the Pall Mall Gazette that Johnston used to write for, actually in print in his magazine Borderland, said that for a whole year I believed him to be the veritable Jack the Ripper.
Dunston estaba en el lugar perfecto para perpetrar los crímenes. Se introducía como paciente de un hospital de Londres, ubicado a pocas cuadras de Box Row, escenario del primer asesinato.
His actual capacity to become a serial killer died, of course, with his failure in health. He was no longer, after 1889, capable of another cycle of murders.
Una de las teorías más intrigantes es la que involucra a la Casa Real de los Windsor. Es estremecedor pensar que un miembro de la monarquía, cabeza de una gran nación, pudiera estar involucrado en los crímenes de Jack el Destripador. Toda la teoría se centra en este hombre, la oveja negra de la Casa Real. El príncipe Alberto, duque de Clarence, fue nieto de la reina Victoria y heredero de su trono. Físicamente débil y de escasa cultura, fue blanco de chismes, especialmente sobre su sexualidad. Murió en 1892 de sífilis. Las versiones varían. Sir William Gould, médico de la reina, príncipe Edward Albert. La teoría sobre la Casa Real comenzó en serio, cuando Sir Thomas Stowell publicó un artículo en 1870, asegurando que Sir William Gould, médico de la reina, había cometido los asesinatos junto con el príncipe, quien ya estaba en la fase terciaria o alucinatoria de la sífilis, lo que de alguna forma lo empujaba a masacrar prostitutas.
And in that way, leaps and bounds, almost like a fantasy game, the Duke of Clarence was dragged in for the first time. That immediately attracted worldwide attention because anything to do with the royal family sells newspapers.
Luego, en 1873, el asunto da un giro sorprendente. El príncipe había tenido una hija con una mujer católica de East End. Gould y la francmasonería habían encubierto al príncipe.
And the whole thing was a Masonic conspiracy to save the crown because the Duke of Clarence had done something he shouldn't have done. He had married a Roman Catholic lady and had a child by her, and that was death for the royal family. So, in fact, all the people who knew about it had to be eliminated. There were 5 prostitutes.
Según esta teoría, Gould y el príncipe recorrieron Whitechapel en un coche. Buscaron a Mary Kelly y a las otras 4 prostitutas. Luego de asesinarlas, mutilaron sus cuerpos y dejaron sus restos en la calle para que la policía los encontrara. J.K. Stephen. La teoría más reciente involucra a un joven brillante pero extraño, J.K. Stephen, quien era tutor del príncipe Eddie.
The royal family had no idea about that J.K. Stephen was a homosexual and had personal problems. And they developed a very strong relationship between them. Very strong.
Cuando el príncipe se comprometió para casarse, el iracundo Stephen se lanzó a una cacería brutal de prostitutas con Eddie como centinela.
J.K. Stephen, who I think was Jack the Ripper, was a loner to some extent. But he was more than a lust murderer. He really wanted to kill the woman piece by piece.
Si alguna de estas teorías es cierta, hubo un encubrimiento de proporciones majestuosas. La idea de que el heredero al trono inglés era cómplice de los asesinatos del Destripador, o era el mismo Jack el Destripador, es aún material de bestsellers y series de televisión. El diario de Maybrick. Hace pocos años salió a la luz un diario que suscitó grandes debates y exaltó a los ánimos. James Maybrick supuestamente escribió que él había cometido los crímenes del Destripador.
James Maybrick was a Liverpool cotton merchant who died in 1889 and whose wife was convicted on very dubious evidence of having poisoned him. A journal turned up in Liverpool in 1992 which purported to be Maybrick's and to be a confession that he was Jack the Ripper. Very few of us believe it. The diary is not in Maybrick's handwriting. There is internal evidence to suggest that it is not a genuine piece of work with knowledge of the murders, and examination of the inks appears likely to show in the long run that it is definitely a modern forgery.
He fails in too many ways. He just fails the test. But again, it's one of those tantalizing, every time you hear something new and you hear about a new possibility, you jump at it hoping, this is the one. We're going to find out who he was.
That's the solution to the case. So, therefore, if they do come across evidence, if they do come across documentation, they're not going to put it forward because they think the mystery has been solved. It hasn't. And that's one of the things we need to sort of get over, that we are still looking for the identity of Jack the Ripper.
Nobody really knew what was within him. Nobody knew what he was thinking. Nobody knew his feelings. And at the same time also, he was afraid that he might be discovered, which was one reason as to why he couldn't be found.
Hay un sospechoso totalmente nuevo para Jack el Destripador, el fantasma de la muerte, que aterrorizó a Londres hace más de 100 años. Es un renegado irlandés americano que enloqueció a los sabuesos de Scotland Yard en Londres y en Nueva York.
This American was at large in London at the time of the murders. The police were seeking him at the height of the murders. He was arrested after the Miller's Court murder, at which time, of course, the murders ceased. He escaped from England in early December 1888 and got back to America and was never arrested by Scotland Yard, despite the fact that they sent a team of detectives to America to try and catch him.
Una carta es la fuente de esta nueva información. Fue escrita en 1913 por el jefe inspector John Littlechild de Scotland Yard a un colega criminólogo, George Sims.
To Littlechild's mind, he thought that this man could well be Jack the Ripper, and he's American, he's genuine, and we've got documentary evidence of his flight to America.
El autoproclamado Dr. Francis Tumblety es sumamente parecido al sujeto descrito por Littlechild.
El Dr. Francis Tumblety, quien fue arrestado en Londres hace 6 semanas bajo sospecha de ser el asesino de Whitechapel, llegó aquí en el buque Britannia el domingo bajo un nombre falso, el Dr. Frank Townsend. Los detectives esperaron por el muelle y lo siguieron hasta una casa de pensiones en la calle 10 del East. No se sabe exactamente cuándo el doctor logró eludir a sus observadores. Su casera encontró el cuarto vacío. Todo lo que quedó de la historia del Dr. Tumblety fue una valija a medio abrir sobre una silla y un par de botas de caballería inglesas.
Tumblety usó muchos seudónimos. Bien pudo haber escogido el nombre Blackburn para vincularse con el infame Dr. Luke Blackburn, un confederado loco e instigador de nefastas conspiraciones durante la Guerra Civil.
El Dr. Tumblety, alias Blackburn, la persona arrestada en Londres hacía una semana como Jack el Destripador, fue una figura muy conocida en Brooklyn. En los 60 solía caminar por las calles con un enorme perro.
El 16 de abril de 1865, el presidente Abraham Lincoln fue asesinado. Tumblety fue arrestado probablemente al ser confundido con el infame confederado Luke Blackburn. Este fue el informe que el coronel Baker envió a Washington sobre su prisionero.
Todos sus documentos fueron examinados. Había ganado una extensa popularidad como impostor y matasanos, pero no había evidencias que lo incriminaran. Washington, D.C., 26 de mayo de 1865, al honorable secretario de guerra E.M. Stanton. Señor, tengo el honor de recomendar la liberación de custodia de F. Tumblety, prisionero actualmente en la vieja capital. Con todos mis respetos, Burnett Provost, coronel y juez.
Tumblety escribió en uno de sus 3 libros publicados: Soy la persona más conocida en toda la ciudad de Washington. ¿Quién fue exactamente el hombre que mantuvo a toda una ciudad bajo un terror mortal y al resto del mundo a la espera de su captura? Seguimos esperando su nombre.
Serial killing is certainly as old as human society is. When you have a form of behavior that is so connected to the intimate details of childhood and family upbringing. So for as long as there have been children and families, there have probably been these kind of characters.
Jack el Destripador, el fantasma de la muerte. Realmente no sabemos quién fue. Quizá jamás lo sabremos, pero seguiremos especulando y haciéndonos preguntas por otros 100 años.
Mientras los niños de Londres cantan la canción de Jack el Destripador, todavía no sabemos quién fue y quizás jamás lo sabremos. Pero seguiremos especulando y haciéndonos preguntas por otros 100 años.